Hello. So Toronto just opened a new transit line called the Eglinton Crosstown LRT, otherwise known as Line 5. As the name implies, it's an LRT line that runs across the city along a major road called Eglinton Avenue. Now, what's so special about this project is that it's been under construction for the past 15 years. It started back in 2011 and was supposed to be completed 9 years later in 2020, but it got delayed. And then it got delayed again. And then it got delayed again. And again. At some point, people refused to believe this thing would ever open in their life. Hearing jokes about how the line won't be open until the year 3000 was honestly getting a bit old. But on February 8th, 2026, after 6 years of delays and $13 billion, the Eglinton LRT finally opened to the public. First, let's do a brief overview of the line. It starts in the east end of Toronto at Kennedy Station, where it has a subway connection with Line 2 and a commuter rail connection with the Stouffville line. It then continues west above ground through Eglinton Avenue before going underground once it reaches Midtown, making subway connections with both sides of Line 1. Further west, a future connection is being built with the Barrie line at Caledonia Station. And finally, it terminates at Mount Dennis, a new transit hub with connections to the Airport Express train and the Kitchener line. Currently, this 19-kilometer stretch is only phase 1 of the project. A 9-kilometer western extension is currently under construction, and after that it'll likely be extended to the airport. So people were very excited on opening day.
I've been at the station waiting since like 4:30 a.m.
I've been here since 5, woke up at 4.
But expectations were also really low. That's because trams have a terrible reputation in Toronto. The streetcars are one of the slowest tram systems in the world, and I recently made a video explaining why. Even the brand new Finch West LRT, or Line 6, which opened back in December, is horrendously slow. It has an average speed of just 13 kilometers an hour, making it slower than the bus it replaced. Remember that marathon runner who beat all the streetcars after racing them on foot? Yeah, well, he outran the Finch West LRT by 18 minutes.
Despite the conditions, Bauer arrived 18 minutes ahead of his friend, who took 1 hour and 4 minutes on the LRT to arrive at the finish line.
So going into the Eglinton LRT, people were expecting a similar experience. Because although part of this line runs underground like a subway, nearly half the line also runs above ground, just like a streetcar. So people were expecting this to also be a massive failure. But to everyone's surprise, the Eglinton LRT was actually really good. Riding the whole line only took 54 minutes, which is actually faster than Line 6, even though the Eglinton LRT is nearly twice as long. The fact that much of it is underground definitely helps a ton, but that's not the only reason why it's faster. Cause even the above ground portions were much faster than Line 6, and the trains were accelerating really quickly. Cars were still driving faster than us, but to be fair, most of these drivers are probably speeding, and at least we weren't stuck in all this traffic. So the service on opening day was already very impressive. And that's before we make even more improvements to speed up this line further. The Toronto Transit Commission, or TTC, is currently doing a phased opening to basically soft launch the LRT. But over the next few months, service will be gradually increased. For example, trains right now can only travel up to 60 kilometers an hour underground due to issues with the brakes. But in the next few months, this will be raised to the max speed of 80 kilometers an hour. The LRT will also be getting much better traffic signal priority, which will drastically speed up the above ground sections. Right now, the LRT has to stop at every red light, and even once the light turns green, left-turning vehicles get to go first. That means a train with hundreds of people on board has to wait so a few drivers can save a few seconds. Thankfully, due to the outrage caused by the Finch West LRT, the city has finally committed to adding signal priority, which will allow public transit vehicles to activate green lights when they approach an intersection. This will be implemented on all new LRT lines as well as some streetcar routes. Now, I'm happy they're finally doing this, but transit signal priority is a basic feature found in tram systems around the world, so this really should have been implemented from the start. So once they add signal priority and increase the speed limits, I could see travel times on the Eglinton LRT getting cut down by at least 10 more minutes. As a brand new transit line, you can expect things to be very modern. The wayfinding is designed really well, and all stations have digital screens that show bus routes and train arrival times. A few of the transit hubs have large integrated bus terminals that make it seamless and comfortable to connect with buses. The ride on board the trains was very smooth. The tunnels have cell service, and if you sit at the front of the second car, you get some pretty sick views. The underground stations are pretty boring as they're all super white and minimalistic, but this is probably just an outdated design trend from the early 2010s. Nonetheless, I do hope they add more public art pieces in the future because right now, it feels like you're in a mental hospital rather than a train station. Now, one problem is that the surface sections run exclusively down the middle of this wide suburban strode, and the LRT is sort of awkwardly wedged in between all these cars, forcing riders to cross multiple lanes of traffic. In comparison, many European cities use trams to purposely calm busy roads and create a more attractive and safer street. Stops are sometimes placed on the side instead of the middle of the road, so that some people don't have to cross traffic at all. This is one of the reasons why I think an LRT was not the right choice here, but I'll get to that later. But overall, the Eglinton LRT exceeded people's expectations and it will be a game changer for Toronto's transit network. In the past, traveling between the two sides of Line 1 required riding a bus or going all the way down to Line 2. But the Eglinton LRT finally bridges this gap and provides redundancy in case part of the subway gets shut down. The line will also make the city less car-centric, as many areas along Eglinton will redevelop their parking lots and strip malls. But now, we have to address the most important question of this video. Why did this single LRT line take such a long time to build and cost so much money? Well, the thing is, we don't actually know the reason. The provincial government has been very secretive throughout the project, and they have refused to launch a public inquiry. But we can conclude a few things based on what we do know. Firstly, this line was extremely overbuilt. Digging tunnels underground is the most complicated and expensive way to build transit, which is why countries that build transit quickly avoid digging tunnels whenever possible. Instead, they make the trains elevated or use existing rail corridors. When they do have to dig underground, they make the tunnels as shallow as possible, and they build stations that have a smaller and simpler design. This is how Toronto used to build subways in the 1950s for a much lower time and cost. You'll notice that the stations are much more simple, and they're easier to access from the street because they're not as deep. Meanwhile, the Eglinton LRT and other new transit projects in Toronto are tunneled extremely deep underground, when there's plenty of space to make it shallow or elevated. The stations are also enormous, with giant stairwells, concourses, and mezzanines. At Avenue Station, the deepest station on the line, they even have a sign to warn people about the 9-story high staircase. And all of this is just for what's essentially an underground streetcar. The size of the stations are so much bigger than existing subway stations, and yet the vehicles themselves are much smaller than subway trains. On top of overbuilding the line, Canada just doesn't have the transit building expertise. Some countries can build transit so effectively because they don't stop building. They build a transit line, then all those workers instantly move on to the next project, using lessons they learned from the previous one. This creates in-house expertise, and they don't have to rely on private consultants. Transit in Toronto used to be exclusively built by the city's own transit agency, known as the TTC, but the Eglinton LRT was taken over by Metrolinx, a new transit agency formed by the provincial government of Ontario. Unlike the TTC, Metrolinx relies on private contractors to build transit projects. This is a model known as a P3 or public-private partnership. Using private contractors is not inherently bad, but Metrolinx relies way too heavily on this model, which means they aren't able to build as much in-house expertise, and they often struggle with collaboration and decision-making. Metrolinx reportedly had a bad relationship with the private companies building the Eglinton LRT. At one point, there were 260 quality control issues with the line, and Metrolinx placed all the blame on them. There were also 2 lawsuits filed against Metrolinx during construction. Now it seems like similar issues are happening with the other LRT lines that are under construction by Metrolinx. And of course, no one knows why. But at least part of it can likely be explained by overcomplicated designs, a lack of in-house expertise, an over-reliance on P3s, and of course, a global pandemic. In the end, I think people are mostly pretty happy with the Eglinton LRT, but one of the biggest regrets that many still have is that this is an LRT and not a subway. In the 1980s, Toronto created the Network 2011 plan, which included a subway on a portion of Eglinton West, and we actually started construction in 1994. But just a year later, the subway was cancelled by the provincial government under Mike Harris because it cost too much money. Fast forward to 2007, Toronto Mayor David Miller proposed the Transit City Plan, a network of LRT lines crisscrossing the city. The centerpiece of this plan was the Eglinton Crosstown LRT, which would mostly run above ground, but a portion of it in Midtown Toronto would be tunneled. But then the whole plan got cancelled in 2010 by Mayor Rob Ford, because he insisted that Toronto should only build subways.
David Miller's Transit City is a multi-billion-dollar disaster.
That brings us to today. The Eglinton and Finch West LRTs were the only 2 transit lines that got built from the Transit City Plan, and these were Toronto's first new transit lines in over 20 years. But after people saw how slow the Finch West LRT was, many people have been saying that Rob Ford was right. LRTs are just glorified streetcars that get stuck at red lights and shut down during winter. From now on, we should only build subways. Now, I do agree that the Eglinton LRT probably should have been a subway. Eglinton Avenue is a major road with lots of dense neighborhoods, and the line is a crucial east-west connection that links multiple subway and regional rail lines. That means capacity and speed should be the top priorities. But the vehicles on the Eglinton LRT are trams, which means they run less frequently and are physically smaller than a subway train. So they get crowded pretty easily, and it takes a while for people to funnel through the doors. They are able to add another car to the train, but even then, these vehicles will always be a major bottleneck. That's why an automated metro line that is fully grade separated and runs super frequently would have been so much better. That being said, I believe that no form of transit is inherently better than the other. Subways are great at moving lots of people quickly across the city, but they aren't as convenient for shorter local trips. Meanwhile, a tram lets you quickly hop on and off when making small trips through the city, and it's a lot bigger and more comfortable than a bus. They can also supplement transit in the suburbs where there may not be enough density for a full subway. So each mode of transit has their pros and cons, and they should be selected based on whichever makes more sense for the situation. I think the Finch West LRT made sense as an LRT because it mostly runs through lower density suburbs and plays more of a supporting role for the transit network. The problems we are facing with this line have nothing to do with it being an LRT. The TTC is purposely limiting the speed for now because it's going through a soft opening. And most of the delays are due to mechanical issues like unreliable track switches. Now, these are issues that shouldn't be issues in the first place, but they can and will be fixed in the future. To prove that LRTs can work really well in Canada, Just take a look at the Ion LRT in Kitchener-Waterloo, a city just 2 hours away from Toronto. Despite being fully above ground, running through lots of city streets, this LRT is really fast. It has traffic signal priority at all intersections, stations are placed further apart, and rather than tunneling underground or running it down the middle of a major road, they took advantage of freight train corridors to save time and money. While the Finch West LRT was completely shut down after a snowstorm, the Ion LRT in Kitchener-Waterloo was running smoothly. Rob Ford was against LRTs not because they don't work, but because of ideological reasons. He was elected to stop the war on the car, because he believed that roads should only be for cars, and that public transit should only exist when it's not in the way of traffic.
It's time to stop the war on cars.
And now, the same ideology is being perpetuated by other right-wing politicians with Ford in their name. The whole point of David Miller's Transit City Plan was that subway projects are expensive and were constantly being cancelled due to a lack of funding. So his plan would quickly build a transit network throughout the city for a much lower cost. Now, I don't agree with parts of this plan, but I think we ultimately need a mix of different transit modes. Sometimes we do need subways, but we can also make transit so much better in Toronto by upgrading all the streetcar lines so that they're actually fast. And that would cost way less money and take way less time. LRTs can still fill in the gaps when subways don't make sense. For example, we can use LRTs to connect small suburban towns and also bridge the gap between commuter rail stations. This is done in many cities around the world like Paris and Hong Kong. Thankfully, the failures of Toronto's LRTs might actually be a blessing in disguise, because it finally got our city leaders to do something about our broken streetcar network. So hopefully, Torontonians will soon get to experience what a decent tram system feels like. Because although we do need more subways, a good transit system should also have some good trams.